Afternoon, I'm Colonel Lincoln Farish with my trusty pipe hawk. Let's talk about insurgency. What are the elements necessary for an insurgency to occur, and where do you find followers? Now remember, these are my thoughts, not DoD, USK, SWIC, or anyone else's. If you understand how to build an insurgency, you'll understand how to take it apart. Let's get started. There are only a few things necessary to foment revolution, but you have to have each one of them. The first and most important is a problem that the government can't or won't fix. Democracies tend to be very resistant to revolution because there's a process for the people to address government, to point out there's a problem, and for government to fix that problem. If they cannot or will not, with the next election you can hire different people to solve the problem to your satisfaction. For instance, in the United States at one point it was very difficult to get a divorce. People petitioned the state legislatures to fix the process, and over time most states went to no-fault divorce. It took time, it was not an easy process, but there was a process which kept people from going straight to revolution. However, not everywhere is a democracy, and then if the government can or won't fix it, there's no process to point out there's a problem short of revolution. Now, it doesn't even really have to be a problem, it has to be perceived as a problem. If you live in a country that's not a democracy and the acceptable level of corruption is quite high, replacing one government with a different government won't change the corruption. It'll just change who's benefiting and who's not. And that's the other thing you have to do. You have to point out there's an in-group that benefits from the problem and an out-group that is harmed by the problem. Once you have all of that, you have a cause, and a leader will arise who will point out that the cause is unjust. He will make the argument that there is a problem in the country and that he has a solution for that. All you have to do is follow him. Next, you need money, and the reason you need money is you need to buy things. You need to pay salaries. You need to acquire food, weapons, medical gear. Next, you need cadre and training area. That's a little more complicated than I want to go into right now, so we'll get to it here in just a second. Lastly, you need followers. And who are going to be the followers of this? The poor. And the reason for that is bad governance impacts the poor first and hardest. You're also going to get the angry, those people who are looking to harm something or someone, and the disaffected who hate governments. Problems provide a lot of things. First, they show there's a lack of legitimacy in the country. If the government can't solve this problem, why are they in charge? Why are our taxes going to them if they can't fix this? Justification for action. We wouldn't have to rise up and burn down all these places if the government would just fix this problem for us. And more importantly, if you live in a repressive government, if they can break the law, we can break the law. And lastly, remember that the proposed end state, given to you by the leader, and what you actually end up with are often two very different things. The supreme leader. Usually it's an idealist and an intellect who spend a long time thinking on the problem of government and devising a solution, and then providing a roadmap that not only well understood, clearly articulates the problems and the solutions, but is also widely accepted. And this works because the idealists get the ball rolling. The problem is thugs realize there's power to be had and take over. As an example, in the Russian Revolution, the February Revolution of 1917 saw Tsar Alexander abdicate the throne. A guy named Prince Lavov becomes chairman of the Russian Provisional Government. He retains that job until July, when he steps aside for Kerensky. Kerensky only makes it until November, when Lenin realizes with his Bolsheviks, with enough killing, they can be in charge. So that's what they do. With the Chinese Revolution, Mao was one of the original founders of the Communist Party of China. And he wasn't the first chairman, but the others seemed not to do quite as well if they went up against him. And by the end of the Long March, he had taken over as chairman. Lastly, Abdullah Yusuf Azam set up the precursor to Al-Qaeda to help the Mujahideen fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. And he recruited a guy named Osama bin Laden to help him. Osama came, and after a while, Abdullah mysteriously died, and no one has ever figured out who the assassins were. Most of the funding revolutionary and terrorist groups get come from states, but occasionally they do like to supplement their income with a little bit of robbery, like 1907 when the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks robbed Tiflis Bank, or 2004 when the IRA did the same thing. Taliban, Hamas, and Hezbollah have all been known to move drugs. Some have sold weapons and pretty much engaged in any illegal activity that'll net them some income. Cadre and training, almost always state-sponsored. The Soviets, China, Iran, other places. Traditionally, it was done in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. Now you can find Sudan and a few other places where you can find training camps where various groups get together. And you would have, at least in the Bekaa Valley, anyone from the PKK to Hamas, Hezbollah, the IRA, 17 November, the Red Brigades, all these various groups under the umbrella of international communism, learning and training. And the reason you want to have a separate location for your cadre and training grounds is don't train where you fight. Good example of that was during the Rhodesian War, ZANU, who was supported by the Chinese, and ZAPU, who were supported by the Soviets, had camps in Mozambique right across the border from Rhodesia. And the reason for that was if Rhodesian forces crossed the border, they're technically invading Mozambique, and everybody could act all shocked and hurt and upset. But ZANU and ZAPU were criminals, just doing criminal stuff. And so if they trained up in their camp and then crossed the border to kill a bunch of Rhodesians, it was okay because they were just a criminal. Last but not least, you need your troops, your cannon fodder. Where are you going to get those? Where are your dispossessed? Your people who are angry and used to violence. They're out there. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. As a follow-on to the insurgency course, let's talk about the punk movement and how that could be subverted to help support an insurgency. Just so we're on the same sheet of music, let's make sure we have a couple definitions here. A terrorist or terrorism is a method of achieving a political goal, usually using fear and threat of violence, according to JP 102. An insurgency is a violent armed rebellion, so it's a political movement. Now, it may use violent or non-violent means to overthrow an existing government. And most importantly, insurgents are not recognized as belligerents. They are not soldiers. So again, so we're clear, in political theory, legitimacy is the right and acceptance of authority. It denotes a system of governments in the sphere of influence. And, as always, it's extremely subjective. It's trust in a system. Trust can be made, trust can be broken. So what happens when a group of people believe that their government is no longer legitimate? You can get a subculture created which will be reflective of the members' concerns and will strive to meet those concerns. For instance, setting up clinics or study groups or schools. The other problem you have is criticism from the government or from outside the group. Even honest criticism is seen as an attack and is considered as illegitimate. Group members become very defensive, rely on emotion rather than logical arguments, become defensive and violent, and they will actively ignore or even mock the dominant culture. Now, hippies were nothing more than taking the bohemian movement of the 1800s and bringing it forward. The bohemians were precariat. These were people who existed without predictability or security, and it was romanticized, part of the romantic movement, where simple living and poverty and hunger and disdain for money were held as ideals. Now, hippies were actually upper middle class, and college dropouts started Haight-Ashbury. And it created a subculture which was communally based, music, drug use, literature, back to nature, open sex, and pacifism. And the hippies were involved in civil rights and the anti-war movement in Vietnam, environmentalists, and the women's movement. While the hippies were pacifistic and created political change by actually doing, not everyone was on board with that. And some groups were perfectly willing to use violence to achieve their goals. Charles Manson and his followers, for instance. Other groups wanted to create further political change and became much more politically oriented, like the Yippies, which gave rise to the Chicago 7. The environmentalism of hippies and the need for greater change with the desire to use violence to achieve that change gave rise to groups like ELF and ALF, domestic terror groups involved with what they call protecting the environment. Socialism has been around since about 1830 and came to the United States via Upton Sinclair and a few others when they founded the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. The society changed its name to League for Industrial Democracy and developed a student group, supposedly autonomous, SLID. SLID ended up merging with the National Student League, the communists, straight-up communists, to become the American Student Union. However, it fell apart right about World War II time frame. SLID was reconstituted and changed its name again to the Students for a Democratic Society in 1960. In 1962, a group of SDS members went to Port Huron in Michigan and developed the Port Huron Statement. Now, the Port Huron Statement intellectually laid out the U.S.'s shortcomings as SDS saw it and vowed to work with whomever necessary to intellectually work through the problems and to create a better, more just society, with the promise that they wouldn't go nuts with power if given it. This fires up the youth of America, high school and college, and sets off what we call the 60s with the anti-war movement, the free speech movement in Berkeley in '64, on and on. The problem is, while intellectually SDS had addressed the problems, just like with other revolutions, thugs came along and decided that they wanted action now and started splintering SDS to include a group called the Weathermen Underground. Interesting bit of trivia: which union allowed the SDS to stay at Port Huron and develop the Port Huron Statement? So starting in '64, there were massive student protests at college campuses across the nation. But what caused those protests to stop? The first was in 1969, SDS had factionalized to the point of it being ineffective. So there's no more overarching group to help mobilize students and to keep things straight. Secondly, Richard Nixon, starting in 1968, started hinting he was going to get us out of Vietnam. By 1969, when he'd taken office, he started downsizing the number of troops in there. By '72, they were all out. '73, he got rid of the draft. So the 60s were really from '64 to '72, and it collapsed once college students no longer worried about going to Vietnam. They ended up rejoining society. Punk was a musical genre describing the alienation and social discontent of the '70s. Unlike the student movement, punk focused on the working class. The student movement focused on the upper middle class. While student protests often got violent, punk started off as violent. The student movement wanted to work within society to change it. Punk rejected society without a replacement. In a lot of ways, the punk movement was a revival of the 1920s anarchist movement. Why was there so much discontent in the '70s? One of the first reasons was inflation. Inflation was about 7% year over year. That was double the rate in the 1960s. The good times of the '50s and '60s, where you could get a job at a factory, manufacture goods that would be sold throughout the world, started to dry up. Other countries, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, rebuilt their factories, started producing manufactured goods, competing with the US, which meant there was a deindustrialization going on in England and in the US. People no longer get a good job manufacturing goods. This led to layoffs and high unemployment. It also meant that if you graduated high school and you were hoping to get a job at the factory where your dad worked, that was gone. 1972, Munich Olympics occurred. The PLO took Israeli athletes hostage. That was broadcast throughout the world. You had an oil embargo in 1973. Strikes. With high inflation, wages weren't keeping up. Workers went on strike to get a larger share of the money. The IRA began its bombing campaign in the '70s, along with Weathermen Underground, along with other terrorist organizations. You had disco. You had the worldwide thalidomide scare. The Anarchist Cookbook was published, which gave more people the knowledge of how to be destructive. And lastly, Elvis died. So while punk was a genre of music, it also became a subculture, and as a subculture developed a series of values. They rejected society as a whole, anti-authoritarian. They didn't agree with buying and selling of stuff. They're anti-corporate, anti-consumerist. They believed in direct action, violence, no selling out. Jello Biafra was attacked one time for supposedly selling out because the dead Kennedys were mildly successful. And there was a whole lot of nihilism. So in the United States, punk music started to attract those who craved violence and were nihilistic. It becomes a recruiting ground. Skinheads, for instance, were mostly apolitical. The neo-Nazis started to try and recruit them, and to stop that, the Anti-Racist Action Network formed. And this was all over a fight of who's going to be in charge of the scene, what makes something authentically punk. Skipping ahead just a little bit and focusing on the Anti-Racist Action Group. In the 1990s, they worked with the Southern Poverty Law Center against third-wave Ku Klux Klan in the Ohio and Midwest, and they'd come up with a way to identify and neutralize enemies. Doxing. They'd post personal information of them, full names, dates, places of birth, home address, names of their close family members and partners, and contact information such as phone numbers. Eventually, the Anti-Racist Action Group was courted by Antifa out of Germany and the Anti-Fascist Action Group out of England. Now, Anti-Fascist Action was working class, but Antifa was middle class intelligentsia. And the ARA went with Antifa. Rose City ARA officially changed over to Antifa in 2007. So what happened with the punk movement in the United States? Well, part of it was the movement fractionalized. You had different subgenres of punk, like hardcore and horror punk and garage punk and riot girl. And with this factionalization became a decrease in the numbers. Secondly, nihilism never lasts. Third, drugs and breakups destroyed a lot of the early bands. However, some bands or band members found success and left the punk scene to go do other things. Most importantly, though, by the mid-'80s we had a working economy, so the pool of angry, resentful young men looking to lash out in their frustration started to dry up. The malaise of the 70s was banished, and with that, the punk scene once again went back underground. So the question becomes, could drill or trap rap become the next punk? Culture can elevate or devolve a group, and you have to know what are the drivers of culture. You have to be aware of subcultures and niche groups. And it's easy to recruit angry, frustrated, broke teenagers if you are viewed as legitimate. Now, it's interesting, Bakunin was a Russian anarchist, and he predicted that if revolutionaries gained power by Marxist terms, they would end up the new tyrants of workers. Hope you all enjoyed that. Now remember, I'm not suggesting that the punk movement was in any way involved with insurgency, just that angry young men are a main target of recruiters looking for people to conduct nefarious activities. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me either by email or leave in a comment below. As always, a book recommendation. Counterinsurgency by Dave Kilcullen. Probably one of the good classics out there. If you understand that book and you understand it well, it'll help you with your understanding of insurgency and how to counter it.